Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author and I run the centre. And today I'm joined by my frequent podcast pal, Jacob Renneker. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube will see that he's in the sunshine and I'm in the dark, which gives you the clue that he is over in America. So, Jacob, welcome. We've been waiting to do our joint review, having watched the second season of The Rings of Power. And just so you know, folks, where we're going on this, we thought we would deal quite quickly with the sort of production value side of it, because this is quite similar to the previous season. They haven't done vast changes of style and tone in that way. So we'll just hit those points quickly, and then we'll move on to the meat of it, what they've done with the story structure, and then we'll look at how it relates to the Tolkien source material. And then we'll look at the characters, particularly thinking about those which are in the canon or in the sort of Tolkien world, and those which are made up for purposes that they are fulfilling in the story. And then we'll end up by giving it our rating out of 10 rings, which I'm justifying as the 9 rings plus the one to be made. Because I thought, how much, if you add them all up, it's sort of somewhere in the teens, isn't it? And that didn't work out as a rating. So we'll go with 10. Right. So, Jacob, first of all, what did you make of seasons 2 production values? All those people beavering away in the background, building armor and sets and costumes and special effects. How did you find all of that?
They're not wanting for funding for these projects. So the sets, everything was beautiful. There was, in terms of like overall production, phenomenal. Again, like the practical sets, right? Celebrimbor's furnace, kind of workshop area that got a lot of screen time this time. For me, like you could tell the practical nature of the set as kind of being a lived in, especially when he towards the end kind of is spending so much more time just there and by himself. And it actually becomes a character in episode 7 or so, or 8, that this space itself. So yeah, they've clearly put an awful lot of time into that. That was one of the, I think the sets where they put the most love into. And so physical production, yeah, phenomenal costuming, weapons. You saw perhaps more weapons on the elf side and the dwarf side than we saw before, by nature of the events that were happening. So yeah, so weaponry again, like, is something that's easy to compare to other film adaptations of Lord of the Rings, and I think that was one where Peter Jackson's films shone was in the physical, tactile weaponry, armor, and that sort of thing. And I thought they did a really good job here. Granted, things look a lot more not quite as lived in. They seem brighter and less tarnished. Whereas some of the Peter Jackson films, there was a more like lived in, grittier, even a little bit. I mean, Elven. uh, Elven accoutrement is going to always be shining and sparkling. It has some sort of dirt repellent that I think is inherent to elf clothing and equipment. But overall, yeah. So I think it's definitely brighter, shinier. If you're looking at kind of like Star Wars prequels versus the like original trilogy. And perhaps so that you kind of have this a series that's taking place before it's a prequel. It's leading up to a more well-known story, and so I suppose there's something to be said for kind of the shininess, brightness, clean, put together nature of it, but and definitely makes it look a little less lived in than just pretty set design. Same thing with Numenor, even though it's been there for a while, and they want to say that there's statues, right, that are kind of decaying or that have been there for a while. They still look really well maintained. So whoever's maintaining those city streets in Numenor, like my hat is off to them and their crew. I haven't seen them in the background, but they're doing a really knockdown job of scrubbing the walls and keeping everything nice and tidy. How about you, Julia? What did you think of
Yeah,
overall like aesthetic, physical aesthetic?
I was just trying to think where the external scenes are in this one. They made a lot of use of some kind of forest, which
Mhm.
was used a lot for the external scenes, for the battle sequences and what have you. They had the scenes which were in the desert in Rune, but I don't know how much of that is actually, a lot of it was on a set as opposed to
Right. Yeah.
outside, a couple of outside shots, but mainly on a set. And then there were some nice new places like Pelagia and Kier down the shipwrights, um, a sort of early version of the Grey Havens. Um, and I thought that, well, also, I thought that it didn't feel as much open air because one of the
Mm.
things that you notice in the Lord of the Rings films is you felt like you were outside in Middle Earth. I didn't feel that as much in this season.
Hmm.
Now I come to think of it, we did see much more of Khazad-dûm, which was nice. I liked the detail of how they grew their vegetables and the lights and the mirrors and all of that. And we saw some more details about other rooms in Numenor, like the sort of the boat dock down in the bottom of the city and that kind of thing. Oh, there was another outside scene there, wasn't there, with the sea monster. Um,
Hmm.
but on the whole, it felt quite a lot of interiors or forests, so limited vistas. I would say I've got one issue when I'm watching it, which is there never seems to be enough people for crowd scenes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
They have a coronation. So compare in your mind the coronation of Aragorn and Arwen with the failed coronation of Miriel. It's basically a number of people gathered in a room. This could be a cost thing
Right. Right.
because even though they got a huge budget, they obviously are doing many more hours than a film.
Right.
But I did
Hmm.
wonder if there could not be cleverer ways of suggesting more people, like noises
Yeah.
off, crowds murmuring
Yes.
outside, or
Right.
the use of the kind of, I don't know if it's still the software, but the massive or the equivalent software which populates um, digital sets with people. Because it just doesn't feel as though there is enough people around, and it it worries me. It's the same in Khazad-dûm, though they did have a they had a small speech at one point, and then
At the end, yeah, at the very end.
oh, there's lots more
Hmm.
people there. They could have
Yeah.
done an establishing shot with the lots more
Right.
people.
Exactly.
Um, so we haven't got the sort of COVID issue anymore. So I'm not
Yeah.
sure why there aren't more people around. And
Yeah.
I, if anybody is listening to this, I would just suggest that they get some more supporting actors
Yeah.
or use some digital creation
Right.
just to make it feel as though it's Middle Earth in its high days because it's on the way up Middle Earth. It should be feeling there's more and more people coming, not
Hmm.
empty vastness.
Right. It does feel like a just post-COVID uh Middle Earth and Numenor, where like people are starting to come back to work, they're starting to go out in public. So you have like a middling because like right, so season one was filming during
Yeah,
COVID. So they have like so in Linden in particular, right? It felt like Linden was kind of a ghost town, not only because of the little strange veils that were the she elves were wearing on the ship, but because you only had a handful, a smattering of people who were quite distanced. But now, yeah, so coming out of that into you know uh, situations where you can deal with lots of people film wise, it should be yeah, and if there are constraints budget wise in terms of like actual actors, I think you're absolutely right. So doing something to be able to suggest, and we did. And you're right that they did that to a degree with the scene with Durin the Fourth, Prince Durin, sorry, yeah, Prince Durin, who then gets to be actually Durin the Fourth at the very end. But he starts out, talking to a small group of people, and I understand they're kind of like movement there from talking to a small group of people to then kind of expanding that there are more people that are listening to him give this speech, and then he looks over and he's wondering, is this actually going to do any good? Then he looks out and everyone's kind of like listening with bated breath outside there. So I get that kind of like movement and progression from him personally, and like the payoff that, oh, he's not, this isn't just going to be falling on the ears of 10 people, but there's a whole group that's been inspired by this. And then it is kind of undercut by the revelation that, wait, you can't just go out and fight the elves because there's something that's worse that's happening inside. So I feel the trajectory there, but like you're right with the coronation and even the trial by water, trial by valor sort of thing. Like it seems like that's a big deal where you're putting the captain of the guard, uh, essentially the public execution. Possibly that seems like if Numenor is a place that we're going to expect to kind of turn to be kind of like a mass, mob mentality where things are going to be going hill so far and so steeply and so quickly that then the Valar have no option but to bury the entire city, then you're going to expect to see more than just a handful of people that are out here just kind of like curious about like, well, what do you have on the schedule today? It's like, well, there's a trial by Valar at 11.
Yeah, I might make
But
it.
I have, yeah, I got a book club, or sorry, a scroll club that we're talking about, Baron and Luthien. It's the really steamy part right now, and we're really hoping to get back to that. So, yeah, like it seems, yeah, that there isn't, you don't have that sense of, yeah, of like a fullness of the world. It very much seems like there's, the camera is following people closely, but to suggest, even, and then that's fine, we need close camera work and intimate settings, but we also need to see like, that this matters not just to the half of 2 dozen 4 dozen people that we've seen so far, but that this is epic in nature, right? The Sauron isn't just enslaving the 30 humans that we've seen. He's on the path, a trajectory of enslaving an entire
Yeah.
land with thousands, millions, hundreds of thousands, millions of people.
I don't want to labor this point, and we'll just make one more thing on this. So, the people who escape to Rivendell, compare the way that's filmed to the people escaping from Rohan, um,
Mm,
where you suggest a long line of people
mm,
and you suggest the line goes off out of camera shot. You could do just, it doesn't necessarily mean there are more people in the shot. It just means you've shot it differently to suggest there are more. That's what I was actually getting at. I
yeah,
thought that they were quite keen on static crowd scenes, a bit like they were in The Hobbit, at in Lake Town. It was better outside Lake Town, but there was often like static scenes of just people in a town square. It felt like there was a lot of town square meetings in this. Anyway, never mind. My vote for strongest costume was Sauron as Anatar. I rather
yeah.
liked his snake costume. Did you have a favorite costume?
Oh boy, I don't know. I do. I mean, it's
Wolf armor's
kind of
always
a
a given.
yeah, a small detail that I like is in Elrond's armor, that you have this kind of wing imagery that on one shoulder also, which is kind of in some ways kind of a foil to uh Anatar's kind of like scaly, or at first I was thinking that was kind of almost like crow feathers, but you really don't have that. It is definitely more kind of serpentine the closer you look. But having, on one side, kind of a serpent, and on the other side, a bird, was, Elrond as, a tribute to his mother, who ultimately turns into a bird, and flies off. And so I think that's kind of like a subtle touch, there was nice.
Yeah.
Again,
No,
very clean.
I think that if you freeze framed quite a few shots, you'd get so much more detail. Looking at the sort of supporting making of type um, productions, I haven't seen anything that goes deeply into what the production team are doing. I don't know if that's in some kind of specialist release they'll do, but I am interested to see the
Mhm.
wonderful work because it's so short period of time on screen. I know that there'd be much more for me as a Tolkien fan to get from that. Anyway, let's move on to the main. So basically, it still looks great, but have a think, please, about how you do your crowd scenes because it's just falling a bit flat in these amazing
Mhm.
settings, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, to the meat of it. Season one was all over the place. And my general feeling is the way they handled the story structure in season two was hugely a huge improvement. It was much more coherent. However, hang on. I have broken down when I was preparing for this the number of storylines.
Okay.
So keep count, Jacob, and see if I've missed one.
Okay.
I think there is a kind of elves in Linden and slash Havens, which means Gil-galad, Elrond, Galadriel, brief appearance from Círdan. And they're the three rings, the three elven rings.
Hmm.
So that's story number one. Story number two is the dwarves, the two times Durin, plus Disa. And then we've got dwarven rings, which brings them in relationship to story number three, which is Celebrimbor, um, played by the wonderful Charles Edwards, and Anatar, played by the equally wonderful Charlie Vickers. And that's obviously Sauron and overall ring plot. So three
Right.
strong storylines. But
Right.
hang on, we also have Pelagia with Theo and Isildur and Arondir until he goes somewhere else, hanging around at the, well, basically hanging around. And there's a bit of an Ent story here and a sort of love with the lady from that part and the mysterious
Mhm.
disappearance of Bronwyn. Story number five is Numenor, where we have Miriel Ar-Pharazôn and Elendil and Elendil's daughter and the faithful, that storyline. Then we have story number six, which is Adar and the Orcs, and
Mhm.
looking at it from the point of view of someone trying to help, rescue, save, make a decent life, perhaps is the best way of putting that for the orcs, the Urk. And then we've got story number seven, which is the stranger, who is walking eastwards with Nori and Poppy and teasing whether or not he is Gandalf or not, or Blue Wizard. And there is this mysterious dark wizard played by the wonderful but underused Kieran Hines, and also intersects with Tom Bombadil, played by Rory. Um, what's his name? Kinnear, Rory Kinnear, the wonderful Rory Kinnear. So that I make seven separate storylines, of which the first three are the ones which relate most faithfully or closely to the theme of the whole series, which is Rings of Power.
Mhm.
And my problem is with stories four, five, six, and seven not really connecting. The first three connect.
Yeah.
The last four are tangentially connected and
Right.
problematic because they might be good stories within themselves, and certainly the Numenor story is really important.
Hmm.
But they still trying to do too much.
Hmm.
And that's how I felt about it. How about you?
Yeah. 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 No, that's really, yeah, that's good that, yeah, for a show called Rings of Power, the primary movers and shakers, like now we actually get, we got the creation of the three rings at the tail end of season one, and then season two is really about the fuller production of rings with Anatar uh, being involved there, and so that makes a lot of sense having around there. It's clear, yeah, that so those other storylines, the non-direct Rings of Power, those are clearly storylines that are going to be paying off in further seasons. So this is almost, you know, so I appreciate, so one of the things that I did appreciate about the kind of long view that you're able to have, that Amazon can have when you've already invested and you say like we commit to 5 seasons.
Ah,
We're
yes,
going
no, no,
to,
no. But let me stop you there. They haven't. They've said they want to do five, but
uh,
season three has only just been greenlit.
yeah.
And it reminded me a bit of the Fantastic Beasts franchise, which said, oh, yes, this is going to
Mhm.
be five films, and there's kind of
Right, right, right.
fizzled at three. So I think we're okay at the moment for those who want to see a sort of complete story, because this was a better season and just much more, just better to watch than the first one.
Yeah, well, that's the hazard. So that's the hope and the hazard that you
Yeah.
have of that. If you say like, okay, this is going to 5 seasons, so the temptation is going to be to like string certain things along, and say like, okay, we can afford the time to spend on these kind of tangential lines that if you watch the whole series, so that let's say we're just going to assume that we're getting 5 seasons, so we can just kind of spread things out and looking at the whole 5 season instead of looking at individual seasons as kind of like self-contained and being valuable in and of themselves. So there's two different ways of thinking, right? If you're just having to prove your value and then you don't know if you're going to be renewed the next season, that's a different mode of storytelling because you have to have it, you have to be able to wrap it up at the end of the season. If you find out that the show is going to be canceled, you have to have somebody able to pivot to be able to wrap it up in a satisfying or relatively satisfying way. But so you see, as one of the things I think that you see the long term, like the investment that they're making or the assumption that they're going to get 5 seasons is in these inclusions of right the Numenor, uh, having it just kind of like trailing along the rune, everything with the stranger and Nori and Poppy. That's clearly like has just kind of been a little something that's going to be bringing in hopefully at the end. So they're assuming that they're going to have that time rather than saying, okay, how do we develop these characters? What do we need for a satisfying, compelling season in and of itself to be a coherent whole that then also can fit together and build on previous seasons rather than saying, okay, we have 5 seasons. Let's have this plot go all the way through to the from season 1 to 5. This one is kind of going in and out here. There's benefits to that sort of long-term storytelling, like we see with this the Wandering Song that in season 1 was just kind of like a nice melody and something that they're singing, but then it actually turns out to be plot critical in season 2, whereas there was no inkling of it necessarily being plot critical. It just seemed to be some traditional song, but then they're able to use that as an actual plot point in the second season. That's something that's a nice luxury to have if you can think if you like it are fairly certain that you're getting a next season, you can start seeding things in. But then the danger is that you're not paying enough attention to the season that's at hand and making sure that it's a coherent, cohesive piece of storytelling. You get too caught up in the broadness of the big picture, this broad canvas. So it's definitely a dance, and there's a lot that you can do if you do have that or feel relatively certain that you have that sort of long time frame. But it seemed like you said it was only just greenlit, and so if this turns out to be a financial sinkhole for Amazon because of viewership or for whatever number of different reasons that could be outside of their control, they could have to. They might require them to shut it down. They might have to financially whatever, like they might have to shut that down. And if they do, then there's going to be all these plot lines that are just kind of like dangling and unsatisfying resolutions because you're not focused enough on individual seasons. So that's kind of it's kind of it's definitely a two-edged sword having that sort of money behind you where you have the kind of
Yeah.
tacit the implication that this is going to go to 5, but there then the realities, logistical realities that this is a business, and if they're not turning a profit on it, they're going to cut it. And so what do you do then with this masterful big picture storytelling when you have to then wrap it up after say 3
So
less seasons than you're hoping?
I think if it had done another season 1, I would be surprised if they did commission. But I think because they've done a better job on season 2, um, maybe it will survive. I've said, well, no, it's going to be another season, so
Right.
some of the answers will come along. But I think the problem about this long view, the 40 to 50 hours worth of material that they're aiming for, you as a weekly experience, you get episodes which just don't feel very coherent because you
Hmm.
aren't watching it as a great massive box set.
Yeah. Right.
Um, and I was
Right.
thinking that the episodes where I thought, oh, this is a good episode, episodes 5 and 7, when you look at them, they actually basically just stay with my ring plots,
Yep.
um, more or
Right.
less. And you
Yes.
don't go and visit the hobbits or proto-hobbits.
Hmm.
You just stay with the dwarves, the elves, the orcs that are attacking, and
Yeah.
it works much more like a story that's wound together.
Yeah.
And what's so frustrating is that the way to make your ambitious plot lines of 7 different plot lines work is already there for you to learn from, which is you go and look at Lord of the Rings and think, how did Tolkien do this? Because of course his plot line splits up into equal numbers of
Right.
individual stories with little sub stories like Erwin and Faramir sort of woven in, all sorts of
Hmm.
lovely little things going on. And how he does it is he makes sure you know where the center of the story is.
Hmm.
And one of the problems about season one was you never knew where the center was. It was kind of
Hmm.
Galadriel, but it kind of wasn't. Um,
Right.
at least with season two, I had a stronger sense actually the center of this story is Sauron.
Right.
And if you follow that logic, it does hang together a bit better. But
Hmm.
is your anti-hero, is your bad guy, is your villain, and the potential heroes, the ones you sort of care about and invest in, are still divided and scattered, and some of them haven't met each other yet.
Hmm.
So it seems as though whilst they've got excellent source material to adapt, they haven't adapted the storytelling lessons. So
Right.
the horse has gone from that particular stable. But
Hmm.
I wouldn't have started from here, is the classic, thing. I would have done something, very different. Okay, so thinking about the overall structure, I think that the way they wound up season two suggests that they were wanting to give it a full stop of a certain kind, a yes and. So there were
Hmm.
more answers given in this series than there was in the last, and it wasn't as rushed as the
Hmm.
previous season. So I felt it was a more exciting last couple of episodes to watch as a
Yeah.
result. Um, but this moves us on. I'm presuming people listening to our verdict on this will already know some of the major answers that are given. But if you don't, I would suggest there may be some plot spoilers in what we say now, because we're going to talk about where it's following what Tolkien suggests is a story and where it's departing and just doing its own little tap dance of a thing. Um, we don't, both Jacob and we don't mind if people leave behind the story if it's a better choice. The problem is when it's a worse choice, I
Right.
think. Is that fair to say that's your
Yeah.
view? Yeah.
Yes.
Um, and on that note, I would say that the completely understandable departure from the law is running the storylines not on the timeline provided by Tolkien, but concurrently. So Numenor happening at the same time as the Celebrimbor story. But within that, there were some odd diversions from Tolkien's version of it. For example, Celebrimbor, I'm afraid, is dead. He's gone. In a very moving, dramatic scene with Sauron. Um, but in what we know of, and you're the more expert on Tolkien's lore than me, but I thought Celebrimbor perceived that Sauron was who he was when he put on the One Ring, and there is no sign of the One Ring having been made.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
So I think that comes up at I don't know where it comes up in the Council of Elrond or something. Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, it's clearly stated that the One Ring was in existence before Celebrimbor dies, and that would have it's kind of meant that ring making, the ring, is going to be separate from the relationship with Celebrimbor and that whole moment because that's been destroyed, and I don't really get why that's happened.
No, yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, and so the trouble with the trouble with elves is they live a really long time. And the trouble with humans is they don't. But that's also the gift of Iluvatar, right? Is that they actually
Mm.
don't live for millennia. So like yeah, so I see the necessity of storytelling to kind of overlap, to compress timelines, to move certain things so that you're not having a new human cast every season,
Yeah,
having that
Mayflies.
turnover. Right.
here's
So
another king of Numenor to deal with. Yeah.
right. Yes. Yeah. So who's the king this season? I guess look, Game of Thrones did that, right? So with rapid turnover of successive rulers, but yeah. So I get them wanting to maintain build investment in a core cast of like human characters who are interacting with elves and who can both progress, whose kind of character arcs are in the same time frame, and trying to figure out where, okay, so how do we need to kind of fudge the human timeline to fit in with what's happening with Celebrimbor and the development of the rings, with the dwarves and Khazad-dûm, like what's happening there? How do we get everything so that we can converge all of these three at the same time? And so yeah, I understand the necessities of the storytelling there, but it does, it certainly follows a different path, and that's where this is the adaptation kind of requires some
Yeah.
jiggling and juggling
Yeah, it's back to the
because of
thing
the
is it
medium.
a better choice by doing
Yeah,
that?
yeah,
And this one is, I'm not sure it's a better choice because there was
yeah.
such a lot of wonderful acting tension between
Hmm.
Sauron and Celebrimbor
Yeah.
to actually say, here's the master ring. And
There's
it,
the one ring you've been
yeah,
had, yeah, at
um,
the end, yeah.
that's
Yeah,
the extreme point for both characters, and it's
yeah.
not going to be available to them.
Yeah,
But you,
that's a good thought. So thought experiment. What if, yeah, so how would that have changed? How do you feel, Julia, that would have changed the kind of emotional dynamic? That's one of the things that I thought was the most, emotionally kind of compelling exchange and relationship was between Celebrimbor and Anatar, where Anatar is doing this insidious manipulation, right? Where he's you leading Celebrimbor to feel that it was his fault, right? Kind of shifting the blame for putting there. This is all
yeah, you
you
did
did
this.
this.
You
This
did.
is you, right, right. So this is, and he just like keeps like doing that, just kind of like subtly and kind of stringing that off, meeting after meeting, and just looking at that kind of emotion, that emotional manipulation, and then having him. So with so what the way that I saw, the way that that kind of plays out without the One Ring, it gave Celebrimbor at least a sense of victory that he got rid of the nine rings for mortals and or for mortal men, and then then he's like, you're lord of the, kind of mockingly, right, like you're the lord of these rings that I've sent out. And so he had like he did something heroic that he was dying, at least he felt, I think felt like it gave him an emotional way to end, not necessarily like redemption, but some sort of like positive end, as opposed to, yeah. So if he's showing the ring at the end, so he has hope that like, okay, at least I got rid of these, and then Anatar says, oh, by the way, I've also been making this one ring that has control over all of them, and then dashes everything. So like that, so that's a kind of like different. So it gave Celebrimbor, I think by not doing that, it gave Celebrimbor a kind of more a sense of like heroic, like upward trajectory, instead of them like crushing and having more of a, it was tragic, but there was at least a positive, kind of like at least a light of hope or glimmer that he had emotional wise. But I don't know. I want to hear you. So
Yeah, I
what
mean,
do we gain? Yeah, like that's, yeah, different from that.
well,
That's more emotionally, the stronger choice.
because I thought the strongest thing that Celebrimbor said in that scene, which I think is the best scene in the series, um, is that, and this goes to the bigger theme, which about are these rings good or bad?
Hmm.
So, this is pushing the distrust that Tolkien had of artifacts, because
Hmm.
he says that Lord of the Rings is a quest to get rid of a treasure, not to gain it. So I can see why they had the Elrond doubting the power of the ring, the dwarves getting more and more greedy over their rings, even though that's not really necessarily something I know that's sourced in Tolkien's ideas, but it's a logical extension of some of the things Tolkien feels about treasures. But Celebrimbor, in his final sort of, I think it's not possibly not even the death scene, it's just shortly before. He says you're the slave of these rings.
Right.
You think you rule them, but actually you're the slave. I think it's the conversation before
Hmm.
episode before. Forgive me if I got that slightly wrong, but I remember that line. I thought that's a really good line. So if Sauron is there saying, "And aha, for all that you've done has just put all these rings under my power because here's the one ring," kind of thing, but better phrase than that. The clap back from Celebrimbor is, "You've just made your own fetter." There you are.
Hmm.
Line. You've made your own fetters, because you've put yourself into, and it's true. That is the point of the ring.
Hmm.
It's in his overreach for power, he makes his greatest vulnerability, and
Right.
Celebrimbor would be victorious by actually perceiving that and seeing it, and himself coming out of his own obsession with making treasure. And it's very important that he lets them
Hmm.
go because Fëanor, I'm not quite sure how to say his name,
Yeah,
Fëanor, with the Silmaril, it's all about getting them back. The grass
exactly. Yep.
through him, whereas
Yep.
Celebrimbor is about
Exactly.
letting them go. He doesn't wear
Yep.
one himself. So those were the themes I would have
Hmm.
kind of thought would work. So I'm not sure if
Yeah.
the choices of the handling of the big overall ring theme was totally satisfactory because of the missing out of the one ring potential. But we'll see. I mean, they've got to, now they've done that choice, they'll need a new choice about how to make sense of its um how it arises in its place. I thought that one more thing which they could have looked at a bit, given a bit more time, is there was a big thing about Elrond distrusting the ring, the elven rings, these are. And the turnaround is, in order to save Galadriel's life. Um, what about the kiss? Just sidebar. In order to save Galadriel's life, he puts her ring on to reverse the effect of evil from a Morg. I think it's from the crown. The crown of Morgoth
Hmm.
has a kind of Morgul blade effect on her, and it's a huge moment. But it
Hmm.
isn't quite. There wasn't quite enough screen time for him to sort of say, yes, you know, he's compromising. It's like, I'm
Yeah.
compromising because I can see that what you've been saying all along is that these have a potential for good and bad. And right now, the potential they have is for good. Doesn't mean they can't also have a potential for bad, which is the story of the Elven Ring. So when Frodo is talking
Hmm.
to um no, again, it comes up again and again in Lord of the Rings, but certainly in Council of Elrond and also Galadriel, it's the idea is what happens when the One Ring is destroyed um, to the other rings, and it could be like the cascading effect that everything comes to an end, or we will just fade. So they are both good and they are also bad. So I just thought that that scene, because it felt as though it was like the culmination of the Elrond story in this season, could have done with just a bit more, um, yeah, a bit more handling. I don't know. What about you? Did you feel that they did enough to explore the Elven rings?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, because this is interesting because like the order that they have the rings made in is first, right? You have the elven rings with their uh kind of manufactured threat of this, kind of creeping black infection of the trees of Linden, and that this is somehow precipitating some sort of fading of the elves, and that we need mithril as the solution.
Yeah.
So kind of like it's preventative, um, uh, and that's created first, and then now that you have these rings, then like okay, who else needs help if we're doing this as a larger project? Okay, dwarves, because they're the means for mithril. Like is mithril. So if mithril is what we need, then we have to clothe all the elves in mithril as much as possible so that they can prolong their lives. So mithril becomes kind of your MacGuffin, that this is what everything is kind of centered around. That's supposed to be like moving the plot forward, and that's where you get the dwarves coming in. And so then yeah, so it's the dwarven rings are more of a like strategic, kind of an extension of the elf rings, and then I think I did appreciate, Celebrimbor as like being resistant to the idea of rings for mortals, for humanity was interesting, right? Because he didn't have qualms with that for elves because he's an elf and he trusts elves, but then the dwarves, yeah, okay, they've been helping with the mine, they're a means of production and we need them from mithril, like that makes sense. But then for humanity, then like they're not quite worthy. That these could be this could turn out really wrong. He didn't quite have those qualms with the dwarves, right? And hardly at all with the elves. But it's just so inserting that kind of mistrust between races was interesting, but also kind of like the moral question of what are these rings doing? Where does power sit? Who is worthy of power? Who can you trust with power? Those are some questions that I think that Celebrimbor raised that are good questions that should have been asked the same sort of thing at each stage with those rings, right? But he was trusting of his own kind, and then ultimately gets to that point, and that's where Sauron was kind of trying to. The more involvement that Sauron has, the more it seems that he's kind of apparent that he is involved and there's something that's not quite right. Sauron seems to be pushing for this more, and he's less and less comfortable with it. So, the, whereas if you have the Elven rings as kind of the solution to Sauron rings, instead of having the Elven rings first and everything else is kind of an iteration of elvish rings, right? If you have the elven rings as being kind of created, if you have the bulk of the rings with the one ring, they're created, but then later if you have then the elven rings that are created in response to that as kind of the corrective to the other rings, that's a completely different dynamic, right?
Yeah, they
So now this is
haven't taken that that possibility. So just on another sort of law issue, I mean, we're fine. Okay, the choices are choices. That's fine. Um, and then the onus is to make it work once you've shut a door on something. Um, so there are more controversial choices, like the introduction of the stranger, who
mhm,
this is where there is a plot spoiler, who at the end of this season is revealed to be Gandalf. Now, this isn't a known route for Gandalf
mhm,
in anything. And they did have the possibility of making the two wizards in this blue wizards who are not really written up at all or only briefly by Tolkien. So there's much more sort of space there for elaboration.
mhm,
But I can see okay, so we want Gandalf in because we know he's alive and we know he's one of the most popular characters. So let's, as you know, Tom Bombadil, he's also alive. He's also popular and not been used. Let's put him in as well.
right,
Um, I can see the sort of writer's room thought about that. And then you think, well, we've got proto-hobbits as well. So let's do a long arc for the founding of the Shire, which I think was what was kind of, I imagine, is the end of
right,
season 5. I mean, I think
right.
that's where it's going. Um, but does this work for you, having Gandalf wandering around, spending all the time trying to work out who he is?
Yeah, like so it doesn't. I mean, that's like that is interesting, and we see just shades of that uh in Lord of the Rings itself, right? When Gandalf is coming back as Gandalf the White, especially depicted as depicted in the films, where he's a minute, like, oh, what? Well, yes, Gandalf, that was my name, right? Right? Like, oh, like that's what you called me. And so you have kind of like a slow. It's not a complete memory wipe, but it seems to be that he's still kind of settling into his body and reorienting himself to this kind of mortal uh frame that he's been kind of reinserted within. But yeah, so I get like I appreciate the impulse to show the development of a character, um, but it's one of the challenges that you face there. That this is something, and I hate to keep bringing Star Wars up, here, but something that where they've had to do certain right prequels or prologues to different series having different approaches, right? So with the Han Solo movie that's dedicated to how did this character become the roguish smuggler that we all know and love. There's a pain that was taken there to introduce, to explain everything. So you have, where did his last name come from? It was from a, passenger. He's signing up, and he didn't have a last name, and he was going by himself. And so they said, okay, your name is Han, and your last name is going to be Solo. The questions that nobody's asking, or there's a need, I think, a felt need to explain everything, to say, here's everything. How did he get his blue hat? Let's explain where he got these, and even the phrases that you hear Gandalf saying that he is hearing from Tom Bombadil, right? That we need to have an answer for basically explain everything that we see Gandalf do. We have to explain all of that. And I think that's the tendency that's where they're kind of like leaning towards. Uh, which is which is difficult when you're working within a known uh, canon, for lack of a better terms, right? We have expectations. People know and love these characters, so there's only so far that you can go. Whereas if you have if you're doing something completely different, if you're following this character in a different storyline, you can do things. You still have to keep the core of the character the same, but you can do different things and do interesting things that people aren't expecting. That you don't have to kind of feel the need to shoehorn quotes and equipment and different things into the one storyline. It allows more room to breathe and things to be more organic. So once you choose, this is going to be Gandalf, we're doing how Gandalf begins, you're kind of locking yourself into a certain type of storytelling that is kind of feels the need to provide precursors for everything that you know and love about this character in the present day. But that's not the only way to do that. There's different ways that you can do that. But this is the way that they chose, and it's for people that do know and love the character, or that even appreciate the larger lore around the character, then this can be off-putting, or this can be where those folks really kind of we could rub them the wrong way.
Yeah, I mean, the problem I have here is I actually really like Daniel Wayman. I think he's a fantastic younger casting for Gandalf. Um, yeah, I mean, it's not a problem with him. I think it is the problem of they're giving answers to why Gandalf is such a thing, which don't actually aren't Tolkien's answers. So
Mhm.
Tolkien's had other ideas about this character, and they're inventing things which don't necessarily feel as though they're right for it. I know they have got, I think Simon
Mhm.
Tolkien is an associate, sort of like an advisor, so
Mhm.
possibly they feel that they can run it by him, and he'll say it's fine. Okay. Um, but I suppose it comes down to, as we're mainly about sort of creativity, this podcast,
Yeah.
that the problem is that Gandalf, Poppy, and Nori's story do not intersect with the Ring story. And
Right. Right.
unless they're going to change how the age ends, they don't have a big role in that either. So
Right.
I'm not kind of sure how it's almost like it's doing its own thing on a separate track.
Right. Right. On the
Um,
rune, yeah. So as the big showdown, they're kind of setting up Gandalf now to be setting up against the other dark wizard, and then maybe that's going to be its own storyline, but there's no even the only inklings that we really get, or maybe I should use a different word from inklings, the only you know uh kind of premonition that this is going to tie into the others, right? When the dark wizard is talking about, we have Sauron is rising. How he knew that was happening is a different question, and where news of this is coming to them here far away in the east. But the kind of the intersection that it looks like it is like these are the going to be Easterlings. These are people that if these people here in Rune could be part of Sauron's army, they could be swayed to his cause, and then there would be no hope for Middle Earth because this is a large s- presumably large population. We really haven't seen anybody in Rune other than a handful of our proto hobbits and these masked. I love the character design on our masked figures on the horsebacks, and that's really fun. But there's only a handful of those. So is this wide open space that we're supposed to be worried that is a threat to all of Middle Earth is consisting of four people with house staff in those kind of temple like
Yeah,
buildings. So
and the Nazgals, of course, as
yeah,
I
right.
think it's
And so to tell you the truth, like for me, like where I see where some of the greatest investment that I have, or what I think is the funnest for me, is when they're developing new characters, right? So those, yeah, the Nazgals, we have your acolyte and your shieldman, the three kind of sorcerers that were out looking for the
the ones who
stranger because they
become
thought it was
moths and
Thorn.
then go back to being
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So
other
those is like
people.
so that's fun. Like that's like fantastic. I love like that. And you can build up more like additional kind of uh adjacent lore that's inspired by, and they could be doing something, having some sort of different story, these masked figures. There's some storyline that's happening there. That would be great and compelling as its own kind of thing, right? This is a people painting on Tolkien's broader canvas, right? That he was saying, he was hoping to do, make a myth um, for England, but that was so broad in its vision that other people would kind of take things up and add a corner here and there. And so you clearly have lots of opportunities for creating compelling characters within that. So those are some of these things that are creative and seeing what do you do in a Tolkien world that isn't necessarily just following and tracing people that we know and love and we know what's going to happen to them. What are the fates of characters? So Arendir, he's not in Lord of the Rings. We don't know what happens to him. So that's kind of a, again, forgive me for another Star Wars, kind of tying back to their storytelling strategy, but the Andor, right? So it's taking one character that is not going to end up, that's not pivotal, that's not like meeting, this character doesn't have to meet Obi-Wan and Yoda and Darth Vader. He doesn't have to have all these. So because this character is not kind of obligated to intersect with all of the other characters that you know and love, you can do more emotional, you have more creativity and flexibility storytelling wise to make stories for the sake of stories that happen to inhabit this world. That's what you can do more with those sort of characters. This is not Legends of the East or Adventures in the East. This is Rings of Power. So you can't. So if you're going to do like that, almost has to be a separate project to kind of bring that in and flesh that out. If this is about Rings of Power and you're committed to following this story, then you really need to hew closely to that as being your kind of like guiding
Yeah,
principle and North Star.
and we're back to the okay, if you've got 5 seasons, you could probably rope in this story by having these being, potentially Sauron's allies, which would fit with the sort of what we do know about the history there. But it's a long time for us to wait without really feeling engaged
Right.
in that story. And I just want to do a shout out to anybody who's writing a fantasy script. Please, can you not do old friend? Ah, all these says, oh, you come to see me, old friend. All these, it's just that came from these Saruman and Gandalf dialogue from Fellowship of the Ring, and it just crops up everywhere the whole time. You don't go around saying old friend very often, but it's like this little mushroom growth that sprouted up in high epic fantasy. So let's talk about the characters. In brief, we want to sort of wrap this up now, and we've talked about a lot of them already. We do have, I thought there was my overall feeling before I give it its rating is that actually for me, this was a series where the parts are greater than the sum. There were bits of it which I really liked, and this was usually down to performances. Um, so I thought that Charlie Vickers was really watchable, wonderfully nuanced, particularly with Celebrimbor, um, Charles Edward's character. So even if Charles Edward looks sort of a bit old to be an elf, you know what I mean? The Círdan character, when he came in, who had he was old but also elven. Uh,
Hmm.
I was thinking, oh, but then because Charles Edwards, who I've seen in things like The Crown and other things, so I've got, I
Hmm.
know him already to look at. I thought, okay, fine, we'll just go with him being Celebrimbor, and his performance sort of wiped out the fact that I thought he's got a lot of lines on his face, that kind of really sort of, superficial reaction to me.
Yeah.
Good for him. He showed that age didn't matter. Um, and I thought that, as we've already mentioned, that those scenes where he's being duped, but also giving his sort of prophecy, they were all really strong and very watchable. I thought the Durins were great and Disa.
Yep.
I liked all of them. Um, uh, it wasn't really a character where I thought, I don't like your casting. It was more a case
Hmm.
of, do you have to be here? Like, I don't yet
Right.
understand
Yeah.
Theo, and I don't understand Arondi, who I quite like, but I don't know what you're
Right.
making of him.
Hmm.
I did like Adar, who, for those of you who are deep in your lore, Adar is one of the names of Tom Bombadil, isn't he? Ben Adar, native fatherless. I think it means fatherless.
Hmm.
And when he is wearing the ring in the last episode and he reverts to his unspoiled elven face, I really wanted Galadriel to recognize him. She didn't, but
Yeah.
it
Right.
would have been
Right.
really
Yeah.
great if these nameless elves, who then became the fathers of the
Hmm.
orcs, she says, "Oh, that's, we play together."
Yeah. Uncle, Uncle so and so.
Yeah,
I was wondering for you.
that would have been an interesting development there because that's the sort of
Yeah.
one of the ideas of where they came from. So I've picked those out. Oh, and for baddies, I think Leon Wadham as the horrible Kemen, who is Al-Farazon's son. He's great. Everybody hates him. Well done, Leon.
Yeah.
You're really
Right.
good at being a very annoying person. So well done, you. Have you got any other characters that you'd want to give a shout out?
Uh, n- uh, no, you've covered. I think you've covered it largely. I think the relationship, the dwarf relationships are just phenomenal. Just the father son, these two, emotionally closed off uh men that are kind of just just kind of butting heads and and then one of them trying to reconcile, and maybe the son wanting to reconcile, the father wanting to reconcile, but neither one of them can kind of quite say it. And so just like that tension, and then even like the reversal of, first Durin, the third, right, King Durin, who says, no, we're not gonna, no rings, no anything. We're not, first dismissing everything. We're not gonna give Mithril, no. And then, you know, Prince Doran saying, no, we need to do this. We need to help the elves. But then they're taking opposite positions then during this season, right? So swapping, so having to change their reasoning, rationale, just showing kind of that kind of polarity shift in what they want, um, and keeping that tension between the two of them with that polarity shift, just emotionally, it was just phenomenal seeing them
So
in that
that's
light.
so that's Peter Mullen as King Durin the Third, and
Correct. And
Owen
Owain Arthur.
Arthur as, just to
Yeah.
give them their dues.
Yeah, is the fourth. Yeah, yeah. No, that's
I did want
phenomenal.
to
And then also,
just want to do your
yeah,
view on Elendil, played
yeah,
by Lloyd Owen, who I think is another really bright point.
stand out. Yeah, yep, yep, yeah, yeah. Wonderful. So like this, and like so, seeing again, like so these familial relationships that are just right. So you have right our Elendil, who as a father figure has lost a child, who is starting to well, with Isildur, who is kind of starting to like kind of rebellious, not quite doing what father wanted him to, but him then losing this child, him kind of following in his footsteps, him keep kicking him out of the guard, but then him finding, Isildur finding his way back into the guard as emergency, conscript for the war, and then father like taking, being responsible for him as a soldier, but then him falling, and then right with the scenes, like the funeral memorial scene where this emotional for him, letting go of him, and then having this other son figure with Valendil, who is kind of the son as the Elendil kind of wanted, but then having that son who's being faithful and they're present, being, murdered in cold blood, and just like his performance there, right, with just like this grief of loss there, and then having to then turn around and essentially almost like see him losing his daughter at the same time of losing his biological son, losing his kind of proxy son, and then kind of this wedge loss of his daughter and his daughter choosing something, choosing a different kind of father authority figure than him. Just like, yeah. So I thought he did really well of staying the course. If this is going, and this is going to turn into a lore wise a story of the faithful versus the Kingsmen, right, in Numenor. And so having him as this figure, his speeches, kind of like little monologues, or mini monologues, mini logs, about what it means to be faithful, right? Is this that he's not compromising his faith. He will renounce what he did, but he will not renounce this core of like his belief, and that this belief that's not lived is no faith at all, right?
So
So
do
I think he does a strong job there.
so do you think Rings of Power has a female problem? I'm beginning to think that maybe they're not doing the best by their female characters, having put in
Yeah.
quite a few. Um, so a particularly strong actress is Cynthia Addai-Robinson as Muriel, but they've blinded her
Mhm.
so that her reactions as an actress are necessarily she's got to
Yeah.
act blind.
Right.
Which isn't necessary for, I'm not sure why they've done that. It's not necessary for the story.
Hmm.
I suppose they're trying
No.
to suggest that this is the reason why other people can sort of put one over on her, but I'm not sure about that choice. Then we've got the two girls who are the proto-hobbits, um, who had much more. I'm not sure they've had much range in this season or
No.
importance. And then I suppose the big problem is Galadriel,
Yeah.
who I like Morfydd Clark. I think she's great, but I don't like the characterization of Galadriel.
No.
She feels very similar to Tariel in The Hobbit.
Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
Um, and so sometimes she's revered and what have you, and like at the end
Right.
where Gil-galad turns around and says, "Oh, what do you think?" And they suddenly remember,
Yeah.
"Oh yeah, she's an elder." Another time she's like this rebellious commander who's making
Right. Right.
choices.
Right.
Um, and her fight with Sauron at the end, the sort of climactic fight, though it has some nice concepts in it, I didn't feel the chills down my spine that I felt when Dumbledore fought Voldemort. For
Hmm.
example,
Yeah.
in whichever one it is, Harry Potter, the one in the Ministry of Magic. Um, it felt as though there could have been, I don't know. I wonder if they need
Yeah.
to think about their women, because they're suffering in
Right.
contrast to lots of really strong
Male characters.
realization.
Yeah.
I mean, let's look at what happened in the Celebrimbor Annatar story. You have, I can't even remember her name, but Helper Elf, who spent most of her time making public announcements on the saying, "Oh, they're coming," and Lord Celebrimbor isn't doing what he should. That lady, I can't even remember her name, the one who was being slightly romanced by the Sauron figure, and then she just dies suddenly, but she doesn't have any sort of life beyond this sort of cipher, and I don't know. And we lost Bronwyn, who in the first season was a strong female character, and with her role seemed to be taken by um, the lady who caught Isildur's eye. I'm trying to remember what her name is. Um, can you remember what her name? Actually, I can't even remember her name, which shows that it's a problem. Estrid. There you go.
Right.
Um, I think that anyway. So my diagnosis is of season two is that they, having repaired some of the problems of season one, they now got a
Mhm.
female problem. So
Yes. Yeah. Agreed. Yeah. No. And then Disa being the strongest, like I think in terms of like your female characters, Disa as being the one
yeah,
who's having the most impact on events other than like Galadriel and even like emotional impact, right? So this is a character again that this is and here's a character that was not, doesn't exist, that they're fabricating this character for this, but she's the dynamic between her and Prince Durin and just how she's like an active participant. She's not just a cipher. She's not just there as a love interest. She's not just there as a foil, just kind of just to or as a prop for the male character. She's there. She's pushing Durin. Durin. There's this collaboration between the two of them, and I love seeing that. You usually don't see husband and wife characters, and like definitely not like two parents with children. We haven't been able to see their children right at work yet, but yeah. So
We
having,
know they
I
exist.
think we saw two of them running, playing with helmets
Yeah.
in the first season, which was fun. So yeah, so I think Disa is a good model for the type of like strong character that can like that has an impact on the plot. And Bronwyn, I think we saw that. Unfortunately, the character, the actor decided to step away from acting to pursue her kind of passion and calling and activism with Iran. But
Huh.
so unfortunately, they lost her, not because of the plot. They would have loved to have her. So she was kind of shaping up to be a character, I think, that could have done a lot and probably given Arendir something more to do than just, but because taking her out of the equation, you have to fold him in
Right.
quickly to one of the other storylines
That
to give him
explains why Arondir is
justification.
just wandering around looking for something to do.
Yep. Yep. Because that
Sadly.
wasn't the original plan. Yeah. Unfortunately.
And
So,
I
so
would
we need, but
criticize them for actually doing some really cliched things with Galadriel, putting her in a cage. The princess in a cage thing. Come on, guys.
mhm.
And the oh, she can only get out because the clever guy comes and smuggles her a brooch, lock
Yeah, with
pick
a kiss.
gifts.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, I thought, oh, come on, do something. Well,
Right.
anyway, so
Right.
yeah, let's challenge them. I'm going to
For
send the
more.
challenge
Yeah.
out on the airways to repair what they're doing with their female
Mhm.
characters, because
Yeah.
having a couple of leaders of the hobbits being women isn't sufficient. Uh,
Right.
really isn't. Um, we haven't mentioned, just before we go, we haven't mentioned Gil-galad, Benjamin Walker. I think for me, his high point in the season was his song. He's got a great
hmm
voice.
Yeah.
I also like Robert Aramayo as Elrond, who has the most northern, like in real life, he's got a sort of Sean Bean accent. So he's doing really well. I was real shocked to see interviews with him. I like both of them. Though I would suggest to the costume designers, because uh, Gil-galad has a round face, a round friendly face, which seems more man than elf, that they could do some
Mm.
he looks better in armor rather than a robe. He he
Right.
he doesn't sort of immediately shout as sort of elf looks at you. So I think they could improve the way he's presented. So, if he's gonna be a big part of the sort of military leader. I'd love to have seen an establishing. He spends all his time being middle management in boardrooms. I would love to have seen him introduced where he's in the sort of practice yards with his lance, which was keen, doing a sort of amazing routine where he's taking down all the other people practicing against him to show that he is this wonderful warrior king as well.
hmm
They've made him quite middle-aged in the sort of tone that's been set for him, which was
Right. Yeah.
because he is a fighter. And why
Right.
he turned up is my last gripe. Why did he turn up at the battle with nobody else with him or
Right.
next to nobody? I thought this is really not a good plan, Gil-galad. But anyway, I think Benjamin Walker, more singing, please, and perhaps a rethink on the wardrobe and hairstyle, um, and bring out a bit more of the fighting side. But that's just me. Um, okay, so now to the crunch, the moment of truth. How many rings are you giving this? Are you distributing to the faithful? Out of 10 rings from your forge.
Yeah, I think a seven. I think I'm gonna go with a seven because there were, yeah, like again, like I think you put it really well that the the parts were sometimes greater than the sum total.
Mm.
If it would have hung together with all of these different parts being mutually reinforcing, all of these incredible performances, these kind of really incredibly bright spots of not spots, they were like, cities, performances, sections of performance that were really that were truly excellent and compelling. If they could just kind of strung those together better, or yeah, in a more organized way, again, like pacing wise, anytime the the story went to Rune, or like any of like you when you were outlining kind of the seven plot lines, anytime it wandered from the main three or to the top, four or so, then the pacing kind of slowed, and especially when they're going all the way to the east, because it's not directly relevant. There's no kind of ticking
Yeah.
time bomb necessarily for what what's the end there, and so it just kind of seems to be more meandering. So if there was something, the more like that line was kind of trimmed out, or at least kind of subsumed into
Not
just
connected. It just needs to be
Gandalf
connected.
begins. Yeah, exactly. It just kind of be like it was an isolated something, and then that's what they focus on. If you're just like, yeah, it needs to be, everything needs to be pushing you towards a particular end for that finale. And so bringing the dwarves in, right? The elven three, the three rings, where are those going to be? What's the state of Eregion? Are the trolls, are Adar and his group, right? So that's the fourth, say they call it the big fourth of movement there. Are they going to converge? All those things are converging together. Then yes, like that's where I'm really picking up and invested, and it's compelling me to watch. So yeah, if you could do more of that, then I would get it up into the 8, 9 area.
So I put the sort of question out on our social media following to see what people thought, and our social media following skews towards Tolkien fans. And you get those who don't like it at all and hate it and wish it didn't exist. I think that someone actually said that. But you people said that about the Peter Jackson films as well. And you get a few people who absolutely love it. And
Mhm.
I can see why, because anything which just means you spend more time in something that's quite close to Tolkien's world, even if not really fully Tolkien,
Mhm.
is nice, in terms of the options of what you're going to stream that evening. I found I like the fact that it was weekly episodes. I look forward
Mhm.
to it.
Yeah.
I discussed it with the members of the family I was watching it with. We discussed it afterwards. It was much more of a watching experience. So it was far more enjoyable than season one, which I just felt like I was kind of let down by it. After having been blown away by visually, just finding this my struggles with the story kind of, weighed at me. So I would say that I give it I'm not allowed to break up a ring in half, am I? So I would go 7 rings as well. I was thinking 6.5, really, but 7 rings.
You're feeling charitable today.
Yeah. And I think, there
You
was
have you're
there
having
was
pity. Pity will save.
pity upwards rather
Yes.
than downwards. So I know that Patrick McKay and John D. Payne, who were the showrunners and writers, with their band of fellow writers and the directors they have, a lot of them are directed by Charlotte Brandstrom. Particularly the finale was hers, I think. But there's some other directors as well involved. I know that they have such a difficult job to do, and
Hmm.
easy for us to sit in our studies just saying, "Oh yeah,
Yeah.
you could have done this, you've
Like
done
they
that."
should have done this, should have done
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So I'm also want to sort of inject a bit of humility there, that I
Yeah.
guess they're they're for me they're doing better, and that's great. So
Yes.
by season 5, guys, we should be saying
Yeah.
9, 10 rings, So let's hope that
Yes.
the trajectory carries on upwards.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm a little bit more hopeful that that's a possibility. I think that's
Yeah.
my final sort of word on it.
Yep. Yep. Agreed.
So thank you so much, Jacob, for talking to me at this length. I think it's worth it's enjoyable to chew it all over. So
It is.
yeah, so thank you so much for joining me on this. And well, I don't know when season 3 is coming out. It could be another 2 years, but we look forward to it when it does come out. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.